Hi everyone, I'm John Tonai. It's a great pleasure to welcome you back to the halfway point into the Daima Fine Art Friday Artist Talks. You might have noticed that I'm not in front of the barracks at Janum today. Instead, I'm coming to you from my house because it's getting pretty dicey out there due to the increase in COVID-19 cases. Today, we are pleased to have two artist presentations. The first one is with Na Omi Shintani, a Japanese-American artist whose work focuses on remembrance, connection, and storytelling by means of assemblages, installations, performances, and social engagement activities. The second artist is Lillian Michiko Blakey, a Japanese-Canadian artist who I will introduce after Naomi's presentation. I first heard of Na Omi Shintani because of her involvement with the Tsudu for Solidarity protest at the Immigrant Detention Center in Dilley, Texas. Googling her name led me to her website. I was struck by the intensity of her conviction for social justice framed within the highly personal nature of her artwork. Naomi's artistic career focuses on community engagement, art concerning culture, the Japanese American incarceration, and women's issues. She has exhibited throughout the United States and internationally. Among the many fellowships, honors, and awards she has received was an Asian Pacific Islander Cultural Center Sponsorship Award in 2014 for curating Our American Stories, illuminating Asian American history, culture, and identity at the City College of San Francisco. In 2012, she received the Peninsula Arts Council Award for donor support for curating Coastside's artists for Doctors Without Borders art auctions 2007 to 2013. She was an artist in residence at the Santa Fe Institute, Creativity Explored in San Francisco, and at San Joaquin Delta College. She's on the faculty at Foothill Community College and is also an adjunct faculty for JFK University in Berkeley. Naomi is a member of the Asian American Women Artists Association and is on the board of the Northern California Women's Caucus for Art. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Naomi Shintani.
So today I want to talk about the importance of art and how I use art to talk about history and collective trauma and use art as a healing modality. And so some of my art is about the Japanese American incarceration, and as that traumatic event did touch my own family, my father's family were at Tule Lake, and they originally were in Washington State and were oyster farmers. And my mother's was in Hawaii, and her father was taken to Sand Island. So all the art that I make about the incarceration is really to heal my ancestors and my family and other communities, other Japanese American communities, as well as I believe the United States and myself. And an interesting aspect about my work is it often contains stories that I've collected or done research on, and it's just a healing aspect to hear these stories, but also to have people tell them to me. And I feel that their stories are a real gift to myself and for my projects, but also for everyone else that gets to hear them or read them or experience them. So I consider it a big honor to be able to take them and present them to the world. And um, one of the things that's changed about my work is that I've gone beyond just the Japanese American incarceration situation, which is of course a big thing, but to also connect to other communities. And my latest project, the Dream Refuge, I tell the stories of the Japanese American incarceration in connection to Native American children that were at boarding schools, and also the current Central American children, the asylum seekers at the borders, in detention centers around the United States. And in that way, people get a bigger view of how children have been incarcerated in the United States due to racism and the political situation that was happening at that time and is still continuing, actually. So I like to present my work in a way that it goes beyond the textbook, in that it offers personal stories and gives people an opportunity to experience how their own lives may be connected, and have compassion or hear stories they may not have heard before. Um, and another big aspect of my work is social engagement or community art, in that I want to make a space for people to not only visually see things, but to hear the stories. So video is a new aspect, and also audio is a new aspect in my work, to give a fuller experience. And so the video that I'm going to show is about Dream Refuge. It goes into my thoughts of how I created the installation and sort of behind the scenes things that go into making an installation. And I hope you'll find it interesting. If I was an incarcerated child, I would have a hard time sleeping. I would be worried, and that I would be uncomfortable, and I would be in a strange place, and maybe I wouldn't have a bed, and maybe I wouldn't have a blanket, and maybe I wouldn't be with my parents. And that idea is just horrific to me. I made a cot a few years back that I called Innocent Dreamer. It was one drawing of a young girl on a piece of fabric that was sewn into a mattress. She was to represent the children that were kept in horse stables at Stanford racetrack. I got such a strong reaction to it. People would come and just cry, stand in front of that piece and cry. I think that fact that it was a child really touched people. I just really wanted to expand on that. It seemed to me that there was more to do with it and more connection with what was happening right now in the world. The name of the exhibit is Dream Refuge for Children in Prisons. I made a healing space for children that have been incarcerated over history and currently in the United States. I focused on 3 different ethnic groups: Japanese Americans that were incarcerated during World War II, and also Indian boarding school children, and then the current asylum-seeking kids from Central America. I drew the children in many different ways. Some of the kids were drawn from my nieces posing for me. One of the things I did, I would just try to talk to the children. I would just call them in and say, how do you want me to draw you? Help me draw you. And so I felt I had that extra support of these children that wanted their images to come through and their stories to come through in the exhibition. After I did the drawings, I felt I wanted to add something else, some other special symbol. I did research on that. And for the Japanese kids, I found that in Japan, they would sew these little talismans on the back of the children's kimonos. And it was a symbol of protection. It was almost like watching their back. One boy, who I chose that he was my father, I decided to sew the symbol of a pine needle on his drawing. That was a connection to my mother, whose last name is Matsuoka, which means pine tree on the hill. And so I wanted to bring them together. For the Native American kids, I sewed the symbol of the four directions in yellow thread, and these were put into red felt pouches. For the Central American children, the symbol that came to me by someone who worked with the children was to put a cross. I have purple ribbon with red stitching, and I was told that the children come across the border or travel with rosaries and crosses, metal crosses that they carry with them. So that's what I put onto those children. The government removed 120,000 Japanese Americans off the West Coast. My own family was incarcerated, my father's family and my mother's father. They raised oysters in the Puget Sound of Washington State. So they had to leave their livelihood. They had to leave their houseboat. They lost everything, basically. Behind the faces in the drawings, there were stories. Stories are of different people that were incarcerated. Those stories were then used to be heard in the book while people are walking around the physical cot.
I search for Minidoka, unravel it from the memories of others. Like a ruined sweater, I untwist the yarn, strands to weave a tapestry, pride and determination.
They would yell at us like dogs. The food we ate was frozen. I didn't get to shower, and when I asked to see my mom, they said no. Ojalá hubiera sabido cómo eran los Estados Unidos, pero no es tu culpa.
Had people come in that didn't know anything about the Japanese American incarceration or native boarding schools. And so their consciousness was kind of broken open by these experiences that they're just learning about. I created a way for people to interact with the installation. That's a common thing in my work. It's a way for people to leave their thoughts or their blessings or their reactions to the work. It's kind of jaded by, what's happening in the world. And now you're coming into the room of sleeping children, peaceful, and seeing humanity in a different light. It's really our moral obligation as Japanese Americans who have experienced a very similar mistreatment by our government to stand up and be able to say, no, this isn't right, and this can't happen again.
Thank you, Naomi. That was a really beautiful piece. I first I've heard that we are having some audio difficulties, so hopefully this gets a little better. And, you know, one thing that struck me when I looked at your artwork is, you know, I'm a huge fan of installation art because not just because it's an interesting looking medium, but because I love the way that it transforms a space. And so when a viewer goes into a place, into a good installation art piece, it's like it surrounds them and they become part of the art. They become participants in that particular art piece. And having never actually seen one of your works in person, seeing that video just really makes me want to go see it. And for those people who've not had the pleasure of actually going to an installation, I really highly encourage you, if you have the opportunity, to do it, because it really starts affecting your emotional and mental levels in a way that sometimes a more traditionally produced piece can. And so when I was looking at your work, and I thought, you know, so there's some very personal things, obviously, about your work, where it comes from a place about you, and there's other pieces that were more obviously about whether it's a more general or more of a universal kind of topic, and then you weave them together. But is there one? Is there a direction you come up with more? Do you more likely start from the personal and go outward, or do you see things outward and go inward?
Oh, I definitely start with the personal first. I think that's where my whole investigation and with the incarceration subject matter came, because I wanted to understand it myself. I wanted to understand it for my family, and then it kind of grew to include other people. And after working on it for many years in different ways, I started seeing the connection as I talked about with other communities and speaking to other people about their situations and what they've gone through. There's a lot of connections and different ways we can heal each other and experience in different ways by hearing other community stories as well as our own, I believe.
Okay.
So,
Wow.
yeah.
So because you work with various media, how do you choose your media or the materials that you do your artwork?
Well, you know, I consider myself a narrator, and so I just pick whatever materials need to tell the story. So I could work with fabric one day, I could work with sewing, and I could work with broken pieces of wood, and I just pick whatever is I think both best tells the story. I don't want to be limited by any particular media, or I don't know. For me, it's a limitation. Maybe for other people, it wouldn't be to have that expertise of one media. But I just like to explore and pick things that draw people to the stories.
Okay. So have you ever decided in this process that, oh, I want to use this kind of material or this kind of media, and then you decide, oh, I don't even know how to work with it, and have to learn how? Or is it all things that you've worked with, or is it just this ongoing process that you have?
Oh, I've definitely had to learn how to do things. And I've also worked with people that are experts. I had a seamstress, Mallory Namorsal, helped me sew all the mattresses. So that was a big help. And with the video, I had Beth Peeler, who is an excellent director, helped me with that. And I had the J-Town Community TV did a lot of footage for me, as well as was interviewed by Stephen Olson. So it's like a whole community of people came together to help me put this the exhibition at the Triton Museum and also the video together. So I'm not afraid to ask for help and to learn new things. I don't want to. It really can expand your world to be able to include different media and different ways of expressing, I think. So,
okay. Wow. So Is there a particular media that you are most comfortable with, or where it's I wouldn't say becomes a signature because that's obviously flexible to the piece, but is there something you really enjoy working with more than others, and why?
I like doing installation as far as what the form is, and I started putting a lot of sewing into things, and I like having the hand work and also the red thread. Usually it's the red thread I use because I feel that's a symbol of connection with ancestors and history. And so usually you'll find some bit of red thread someplace on my pieces. I just enjoy having that getting in tiny on something large and just adding that little signature to each piece of work.
Okay. So we talked, obviously, the central part of what we're doing here it revolves around the incarceration. And so we've talked about work. Do you have any other topics that are central to your work? Because you did mention like other immigrants in the video, but is there other things you do?
Well, I have been working with plants lately, and looking towards them for how humans can be resilient in connecting with ancient plants that have been around for many years. One piece I worked on, I just produced, has to do with ginkgo leaves because they're one of the oldest plants in the world, and actually survived the bombing of Hiroshima. And so maybe that piece could be brought up on the screen. I think it's number 16, where I actually traced some ginkgo leaves and then sewed around them, and then ended up doing some paper cutting. And it was a very meditative piece of work. And I also used recycled materials. And in this piece, I really worked on a lot during this COVID time, because I was just enjoying the detail of it and just researching. Also, I put on social media, what other plants do you feel are healing? And I got so many comments from so many different cultures. Maize was one, Bristol cone pines, pine trees, and various different kinds of plants. So I'm thinking I'm going to do more of this series on resilience through earth and plants at this time.
Oh, that's interesting. Because of right now in our political and social climate, there's a lot of issues of appropriation of culture. Would you approach something when working with, let's say, maize or something like that, maybe outside the Japanese American culture, where it's symbolic to another culture?
I don't really think that that's necessarily. I don't know. For me, it's a plant that belongs to the world. And it was suggested by me to me by someone who I believe it's part of her culture. So I just I don't see that as a particular limitation for this series.
Okay. Okay, let's go. You talked, obviously a big part of what you do is social engagement. And so there's a lot of artists, especially, newer artists coming up, students that are coming up that are interested in maybe social engagement or, community art and things that you do. Do you have any suggestions for them, especially now in times of, social isolation?
Well, I've gotten involved in a few projects that I originally thought, well, I don't know if that's really for me. And one of them is the hidden histories at the San Jose Japantown, where we're working with artificial virtual reality and artificial reality. And so we're going to be learning how to work with that in a way where people can walk around San Jose Japantown, learn about the history, or they can do it virtually from their computers with QR codes. And so that's one way that people can do something, learn a new skill to offer art in a new way. I'm also working on a presentation of the Dreamweaver installation with a ritual that's going to be outside in San Francisco, and I'm working with a group that's doing figuring out how to write the rules for doing exhibitions and festivals outdoor in a COVID safe way, which is really challenging. I mean, even to the point of what kind of music, what kind of instruments could be played, how people could if they can sing, or how far they have to be apart, all these sorts of things. So it's kind of a new world in how we present our work now. On the other hand, online exhibitions are getting, of course, very popular. And I've heard a lot of artists talk about how their work is being seen much more than if it was in a brick and mortar gallery. So, and I think even if we do go back into physical spaces, having an online component is going to be something that's going to be an addition that artists are going to welcome, and that viewers can welcome, and being able to see art in whatever way is most safe or comfortable for them.
Yeah, I think it's interesting on this paradigm shift of how we exhibit our work and how our work is going to be seen. And like, for instance, something like this, you have an audience that may never have seen your work, and normally would never, ever have the opportunity to see your work, and now they can see it. But it's also interesting, the fact that whereas I love about going to art shows is that community of people in the gallery, in the space, and that so when we look at art online, we can see the art, and in some cases, especially if it's electronic art, see it as well or better than we would in a gallery or a normal traditional art situation. But for yours, because even though you may or may not be able to touch your work, it almost has this very tactile quality. You could, in a sense, feel you can reach out and touch something. And obviously now, you can't. We can't be sharing things. We can't be touching. We can't get too close together. And a lot of times, that proximity of people, that closeness of people, creates it helps add to the environment. And it's interesting how you're thinking about, okay, how can I still do this physical installation or this physical social relationship with people, but still be socially responsible. So it's interesting, and it's really an interesting topic that I know a lot of my educator friends are talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So because you are also an educator, how have you thought about teaching methods, or how you revamp your teaching, or how your students receive this information now that we have COVID issues?
I have been teaching for Foothill College, and I have a unique set of students because my students have challenges, and so they are not gathering at their usual daycare centers or places. So obviously, like other people, but so we have been doing one place we're doing live Zoom calls, and I think that in some ways they're enjoying it more, and they're getting more attention, and so that's interesting. And then they get to see their friends on the Zoom call, so it's been really successful. And then I've also been making videos. I do art appreciation, so I make videos about different artists, and those are getting sent out or being put on websites. And I'm also making like digital how to do an art project, like step 1 through 20 or something, with individual pictures. And I think that people are, even though I feel a bit of a disconnect not being able to see my students and talk to them one-on-one and see their work one-on-one, I think they're so appreciating that they have something to do wherever they are. And so it's still a worthwhile project. Even though we can't get together, it's still worthwhile to give creativity a way for people to heal and be engaged.
Okay. So we have a question here from Ken Mochizuki. Have the camp deniers reacted to your exhibitions, or do they just not bother to show up?
I haven't really had that experience. I've had people come that not necessarily denying that there were camps, but didn't know about them. So, and they seem very open to wanting to know more and wanting to talk to me and talk to people. So I have not had the experience of camp deniers.
Okay. I have a fun little story. When I did my project, my camp project, I had when they were doing discussions for the Manzanar for the Department of Water and Power to give the land to Manzanar so they can make it a national park. They had these meetings, and so at one of the meetings, I met these two men who were associated with Lillian Baker, who was a famous, very, very famous camp denier. And so I gave them the publicity card for my show, knowing that I was feeding this to the enemy. And I kind of just thought they'd get really upset and that would be it, because I was in Colorado and they're in California. But they actually went, I heard a friend of mine told me that they went on to KBC Talk Radio and actually were encouraging people in Colorado to come to my show and protest it. And I was really excited that, I thought, oh gosh, this will be really fun to do. Unfortunately, nobody bothered to protest it. So none of them showed up. But it is always an interesting thing when you do something like this. You're going to have, whether, they're camp deniers or after they don't know much about it, but they learn about it. And then they go, oh, that couldn't have happened because this is America, or it wasn't nearly as bad as you say it was. And so have you thought about how you would approach somebody who just learns about it but gets really upset by it?
Well, I guess I would just tell my personal stories, my personal family stories, and I think it's really hard to deny actual personal stories, and it's really hard to look someone in the eye and say that didn't happen, that whose families experienced it, I believe, but I haven't had that opportunity to do that yet. So, but I don't think it's my job to try to convince somebody that something happened if they don't believe that it did. It's all you can do is share the information and let them go on their way, because you're not going to probably change their mind.
Yeah, that's true. So another question we have, Sean B. Could you please comment on your deconstructed kimonos?
Okay. Well, I started a series of deconstructed kimonos, and a lot of it had to do originally with presence and absence, and I was feeling a disconnection from my ancestry and things that were lost during the war, and being the assimilation process. I didn't learn Japanese. And a lot of people in the sansei generation don't speak the language, and I think a lot of that was because our parents wanted us to be safe and to be seen as Americans. So that was sad for me, and I was just thinking of how to deal with that, and I started cutting these kimonos that were given to me. None of them are my family kimonos, and making space for other things to come into them. And the shadows behind the kimonos almost make a ghost kimono behind them. And all the pieces that are cut from the kimono are held in altars underneath them. So the whole kimono is honored in that way. And I've had some people be disturbed about that I'm cutting them, and the way I feel about it is that these kimonos were stuck in a trunk and never taken out, and now they've become art pieces and different ways for people to understand culture, and also the idea that sometimes the beauty of culture can be restrictive. Also, that's another aspect of wearing a kimono is such a beautiful thing, but is also very binding and very restrictive as far as movement or how you act as a woman wearing a kimono. So those are just different things I was thinking about when I made them. And actually, I did take a kimono making class. I sewed a kimono at the workshop residency with a group from Sonoma. Maki and her mother taught this class, and her mother is a master kimono teacher from Japan. And it was quite amazing to learn how to hand sew a kimono. And it did make me take pause a bit after sewing one to cut them. So the whole experience of doing the kimonos is really beautiful and also another meditative process for me.
Yeah, I think that the deconstructed kimonos, it does, speak to that sanctity of the object, that preciousness of the object, and how we place so much importance on the object. And when the object like destroyed away, does it have the same purpose anymore as it did when it was the garment worn? And then you've transformed this object, so it still has that preciousness as an object, but it's a totally different object now, a second life in a sense for the pieces, and that's fascinating. Okay, well, because you show, this is gonna be my last question, and then we'll have to finish this up. But really would like to talk to you in a couple more hours. But because you obviously you're an artist, and you also have this desire to teach and communicate the Japanese American incarceration experience to other people. What kind of venues are that you show at? Do you just show at traditional art galleries? Do you, where do people see your work?
I've shown in so many different venues, and I really enjoy showing in colleges. I've showed my work at USF, Delta Community College in Stockton, where I am actually an alumni from there. And also I showed at Pittsburgh University and Springfield College. So as far as schools go, JFK, and I really enjoyed talking with the students, and sometimes I teach a class there, also a workshop. And then I've also shown in traditional museums. I've shown at Monterey Museum of Art. I've shown at Triton Museum, who just showed my Dream Refuge project. And I'm trying to think where else I've shown. I've shown in New Mexico. I've shown at Santa Fe Art Institute and San Jose Contemporary Museum of Art, also in Houston at Station Museum. And so I've shown a lot of different places. I've also shown in history museums, the National Japanese American History, San Jose Japanese American History Museum, and also at the National Japanese American History Society. And so I've shown a lot of different places, and every venue is different, and every venue has been very welcoming to hear the history, and also to just experience art in a different way.
That's great. Well, I want to thank you for joining us, for sharing your work with us, and I encourage people to, if they haven't gone to the gallery to see her work, go to the gallery. Definitely look at her website. There's just a ton of amazing stuff on there. And so once again, thank you very much. And it's really been a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, John. I appreciate you inviting me.
Oh, my pleasure. Okay, bye-bye. Okay, so now I'd like you to meet Lillian Michiko Blakey. She's a Toronto-based artist, so it was important that I find a Japanese-Canadian artist so they can share with us their experiences during World War II. I remember reading an article on the art blog Hyperallergic about a show in Royal Ontario Museum. It was called Being Japanese-Canadian, Reflections on a Broken World. And I saw the work. I was really impressed by a lot of it. Reached out to some of the artists, and we're fortunate that actually two of the artists from that show agreed to be part of Tadaima. Lillian, who you'll meet shortly, and Emma Nishimura, who will be featured on August 7th. So Lillian Michiko Blakey, a third-generation Japanese-Canadian, was born in Coaldale, Alberta in 1945, where her family was forcibly placed by the Canadian government during World War II. She has explored her family's story through her art and has shared the journey in many exhibitions at both mainstream galleries and at venues for Japanese-Canadian audiences. Her work can be found in the permanent collection of the Government of Ontario Art Collection and in the Nikkei National Museum. In 2019, she was among 8 Japanese-Canadian artists included in the exhibition Being Japanese-Canadian Reflections on a Broken World. This was the exhibit that I was talking about earlier. She has also published written works about her Japanese-Canadian experience. Is it Japanese artist or artist who's Japanese in talking about identity, encounters in race, ethnicity, and language? Konnichiwa in the Nikkei Voice and The Picture Bride in Rice Paper Magazine. Her project Identity Through the Arts is a partnership with the York Region District School Board. It's an initiative designed to raise anti-racist awareness among children and to welcome diverse communities. Currently, she is collaborating with Japanese-Canadian artist and filmmaker Jeff Chiba Stearns on an intergenerational story on Japanese-Canadian family history and cultural identity. I'm pleased to introduce to you Lillian Michiko Blakey.
It took me a long time before I started to look at my Japanese-Canadian past through my artwork. It was 14 years after the redress was signed by Art Nikkei, who was the leader of the National Association of Japanese Canadians, and the Prime Minister of Canada, Brian Mulroney, on September the 22nd, 1988. I was 57 years old before I really started doing any artwork on my family story. This painting, Shikatakanai, It Can't Be Helped, Alberta, 1951, was my very first expression of my family story. It's my own memory of the sugar beet fields of Alberta, where my family were relocated to, and they worked from dawn until dusk. I see myself hiding behind my mama doll. My clean white dress contrasts with the life of toil, and it's a reminder of the city life that my parents left. My mother always put me in dresses, even in the fields. I remember the day that I showed this painting to my closest friends, who were all leaders in education at the highest level. I told them my mother's story of what had happened to her when every single 22,000 Japanese Canadians were removed from their homes in British Columbia and interned. My friends were shocked. They had not known that such injustice had ever happened in Canada. My mom, who was with us that day, I could see by her face, that she felt really, really validated, and she was smiling. And she now felt that her story was an important part of Canadian history. I had first asked her to write her story in 1995, and she had said no one would be interested in my life, and that made me feel really sad. I told her that it was really important for her grandchildren to know what had happened to her, so she wrote it. And her writing has been a really valuable source for me to know firsthand what my family had gone through. But it was 10 years after I did this painting that I decided to tell my family story through my art so that Canadians would know what had happened. And it took me most of my life to make that decision. Up until that time, I had painted only Western images and mainstream Canadians. There was nothing which betrayed the Japanese part of me. I really had to, get my courage up to approach the curator of the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center Gallery in Toronto, Bryce Kambara, to give me a solo exhibition. I knew that many Issei and Nisei would prefer to leave the past behind. They could not speak for themselves, so I decided I would speak for them. No government has the right to take away citizenship from its own people, and no government has the right to steal everything from its own citizens. This exhibition at the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center, Omi Michiko, a sansei artist journey, gave me tremendous validation as it was well received with accolades by both Japanese Canadians and diverse people. There were no negative comments. One response in the guest book stands out for me. For some, our story was new, surprising, enlightening. I'm sure they will repeat what they learned from your talk and artwork. Who knows? But one grows many. Think about it, Lillian. At this moment in time, yours is the lone voice speaking out for all the Japanese who had suffered at the hands of the government during the last war. I wonder how many our parents' age are still alive, giving an authentic voice to the experience. Our generation does have memories and voice, thanks to you. But it was my mom who lugged water from the lake and emptied the pot and took it to the outhouse in Geraldton. Another voice just recently passed. What you are doing through your art is so important. It's not only artistically, but historically, sociologically, and politically significant. You have much to teach and must continue. After I read that, I realized that even though it's not a comfortable thing to keep on going over the difficulties of your family, that I had to continue. And so I have continued to tell the story in different ways to reach different audiences. But it's never easy, because every time I tell the story, I feel my heart break for my gentle parents and grandparents. In April, I was scheduled to give a talk to an audience at the Aurora Public Library, but it was canceled along with everything else because of COVID-19. So I collaborated with the library to create a series of podcasts which chronicle my journey to self-discovery, from my family's story of forced removal to Alberta, then their exodus to Ontario, and finally the journey to redress and the present. All three podcasts can be found on YouTube by searching Aurora Public Library, Lillian Michiko Blakey. They can also be found on my website, www.blakeyart.ca. Here is podcast 1, Out of the Ashes.
My name is Lillian Michiko Blakey. This is a story about my family. Out of the Ashes. In ancient mythology, the majestic phoenix is said to die, consumed by a burst of fire as blinding as the sun, but it rises from its ashes and comes to life again. And so it became a symbol of eternal life and fresh beginnings, overcoming the darkness of destruction for many cultures and throughout time. It rises to the challenge to become powerful again and succeed. Its invincibility is a testament to its determination to survive. As such, this is a story of what happened to the 22,000 Japanese Canadians who were forcibly removed from their homes in British Columbia by the Canadian government when Japan joined Germany against us in World War II. Japanese Canadians lost everything: their livelihoods, their homes, their businesses, their belongings. But most of all, their identities as Canadian citizens. The unspeakable loss was catastrophic. Like the phoenix, their story is also about renewal and rebirth. This unspeakable horror had happened to my family, to my grandparents, who came to Canada at the turn of the century and became Canadian citizens, to my Canadian-born parents, and to me, a sansei, a third-generation Canadian. In her memoir, my mother wrote, I was listening to the radio when I heard that Japanese planes were coming to raid the West Coast. I'll never forget that day, December 7th, 1941. It was the worst day of my life. I was stunned and very afraid. Of course, the planes never did come as far as Canada, but they did attack Pearl Harbor, the American base in Hawaii. From that day on, life changed for us. Even though we were Canadians, we were called aliens and treated as the enemy. It was awful. Young people like me had never been to Japan. We honored the British flag, loved Frank Sinatra, and danced the foxtrot. It was hard to understand what was happening. A curfew from dusk to dawn was imposed, and we were not allowed to leave the house after dark. I was 19 when war against Japan was declared. The Canadian government forcibly uprooted all Japanese Canadians from the West Coast. Women and children could go to internment camps and men to road camps in the interior of British Columbia. Or families could stay together to work on the sugar beet farms in the prairies. My mother wanted our family to be together, so we decided to relocate to Alberta. Before leaving Vancouver, Eunice sold the furniture, but our father's boat was confiscated without any compensation. Father had just cleaned and painted his boat for the winter. He renamed the boat Nancy after Eunice's first daughter. Father was a naturalized Canadian, and we were Canadian-born, but we had no rights. They even took away my little Kodak box camera. We were allowed to take only one suitcase for each person. Everything else was left behind. The government said that we could reclaim our things after the war, but that never happened. In May 1942, we arrived in Lethbridge, Alberta by train and were escorted like convicts by the RCMP. Our clothes were inappropriate for the harsh Alberta winters. We were city people with city clothes. We were fingerprinted and had to carry identification cards everywhere we went. This was the most terrible time of our lives. The farmers who picked us to work on their farms were at the station to claim us. My parents, Rosie, and I were taken to Coaldale. Eunice's family went to a Hungarian farm in Lethbridge. Mother was worried about separating from Eunice's family because Eunice's 3 children were so small, so she left us to join them. Then she worried about us, so we got permission to leave the Coaldale farm to join Eunice and her family to work the sugar beet fields together at the Hungarian farm. Our so-called house was a chicken coop, which was extremely cramped for the 9 of us. Eunice, her husband, her 3 children, my parents, Rosie, and myself. We had barely enough room to cook, eat, and sleep. The room was filthy with chicken droppings all over the place. The window was broken, and orange crate slats were hastily nailed over the opening. An old broken down screen door with cardboard was our door. Mother hung a comforter to keep the cold air out, but it was useless. Full stove was kept going night and day to keep us from freezing, but we were always cold. We had come from very moderate winters in Vancouver to the very bitterly cold prairie winters, which often dipped to -30 or -40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit temperatures. The farmers were supposed to provide us with proper housing and bedding, but this farmer provided neither. The bedding were sacks filled with straw. That first winter was excruciating. In summer, it was unbearable inside. There were hundreds of flies everywhere, in our hair, on our faces, all over the walls. Once, as I was talking, a fly flew into my mouth. You cannot imagine how horrible that is. We were spraying the pesticide DDT all of the time, but that still did not kill them off. Today, the government bans this pesticide because once it gets into your body, it cannot be eliminated. I shudder to think about it now, as we had used a lot of it in the 1940s. You cannot imagine more backbreaking work than a sugar beet farm. We faced many hardships, thinning beet plants, weeding, hoeing, and finally topping the beets. We rose at the crack of dawn to go out to the field. The beets were planted in thick rows about 3 feet apart, and when they were about an inch high, we thinned them out to single plants about a foot apart, all the way down the rows, row after row after row. We worked until dusk when we could no longer see what we were doing. When we returned home, we did all of our chores: cooking, washing, preparing food for the next day, putting the children to bed. All we did was work, work, work. A few weeks after the thinning was finished, the farmer cultivated the ground with his horses, and we would go over the whole field, hoeing and pulling out the weeds. If there was a drought, the farmer irrigated the field with water diverted from a canal. Topping started around the end of September. The farmer used his horses again to pull a plow to loosen the soil around the beets. It was our job to pull the beets out of the ground. We took 2 beets, one in each hand, and banged them together to shake off the soil. Then we cut the tops off and threw the beets onto piles as we worked along. Sometimes the soil was wet and it was very heavy lifting. Since it was very sticky gumbo soil, it was exhausting work when caked with mud. I weighed only 90 pounds, so the work was daunting. Even when the weather was awful, we had to keep on working until we had finished the whole 20 acres before winter set in. There were times when the beets that we pulled out of the ground were frozen solid. We worked alongside German prisoners of war who were very pleasant young men. I found out that they could understand French, so we were having a great time. The soldiers guarding them with rifles reported the Germans, so we did not see them again for several days. They were punished for speaking to us. There was a barbed wire fence around the field to keep the cows out or to keep us and the Germans in. Eventually, my dad was allowed to join my mom, and they were married in Coaldale, Alberta, where I was born. The rest of Mom's family were deported to Japan after the war was over in 1946. My mom and dad refused to go with them. Since they earned only $900 a year between the two of them, It took 10 back-breaking years for my mom and dad to save enough money for the train fare to relocate to Ontario. Here is a story I wrote about my father, African violets and sakura, after we settled in Ontario.
Last year, I did a series of 5 larger-than-life drawings. The series was called Shikataganai, Sansei Forgiveness in a Broken World. For most Japanese Canadians, our whole world was broken for 3 generations. I'm a sansei, 3rd generation, who has struggled with the silence and found myself at last near the end of my life. This series depicts my past as a young woman who was ashamed of being Japanese to my present as a woman who has finally learned to forgive and let go the burden of shame carried by all Japanese Canadians who were dispossessed and relocated. When I look at my work, I see a clear dichotomy of who I am. I value being Japanese, so I have chosen to work primarily with Japanese papers and Japanese ink. Yet, the pen and ink technique is Western, not Japanese sumi painting. Even now, I feel like an outsider in both cultures, yet totally comfortable looking in. The first one is, keep the past in the past. Don't talk about what happened. I grew up feeling that it was a bad thing to be Japanese Canadian because my parents never spoke about what had happened to them. The next one is, eyes are the enemy alien. I hated my eyes, as they were the most obvious feature which made me different from all of my friends. The third one is wannabe. More than anything, I wanted to be white and I hated being Japanese. Here, I want to be Marilyn Monroe. It took me my entire life to forgive the broken world of the past and love who I am. The irony is that Marilyn is on a Japanese fan, and I am hiding behind it. Death mask, end of my line. I married outside of my culture, as did 95% of the sansei. I am the last of a long line who stretches back for thousands of years. This revelation just boggles my mind. Unmasked. I finally find closure near the end of my life. I've learned to forgive myself for hating myself. I no longer feel that my eyes are hateful. I did another series in terms of trying to find my identity. The series is called Who Am I? My parents bore the shame and put the past behind them. Because of the silence, I grew up feeling that it was bad to be Japanese Canadian. In How Can I Be a Canadian Who Is Not a Canadian? I show the identity cards of both my parents. All Japanese Canadians had to be fingerprinted and carry these identification cards at all times. They had to produce it to anyone who asked to see it. They felt like criminals. So I wrote in the artwork, who is a Canadian who is not a Canadian? I asked. Is a Canadian who is not a Canadian a Canadian? I asked. In Why Can't I Be Like Everyone Else? I see myself in my predominantly white classroom. When I first went to school in Ontario, there were no Asian or Black children in the whole school. The children were all very kind to me and accepted me as one of them, but I felt different, an outsider. I wanted to look like mainstream Anglo children. I was ashamed of being Japanese. I decided at age 6 to stop speaking Japanese, my first language, at home. It must have hurt my parents very much. Target. I grew up with war movies, anti-German, anti-Japanese. There were a huge number of war films in the 1950s and 60s. I always felt that the Japanese were them, not us. In my teens, the boys wanted to see if I were like the geishas in the movies. On the one hand, I was flattered that white boys wanted to go out with me. On the other hand, I hated being seen as exotic. Here, I feel targeted by any reference to Japanese. As a result, I became a very shy, quiet, and easily embarrassed child. I grew up denying my own culture. Wanted, model Canadian. The Japanese are a shame culture. Everything an individual does reflects on the whole community. Because of the forced relocation of Japanese Canadians during World War II, we felt that if they behaved as perfect Canadians, they would once again be accepted as members of Canadian society. I'm a sansei. Still, I always felt that I had to earn my citizenship. My father wanted me to be perfect in every way, especially at school. I became obsessed with being the best. This work is reminiscent of a wanted poster. Wanted, enemy, alien. There was not a single act of rebellion during World War II by Japanese Canadians. Wanted, model minority. See no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. Wanted, model assimilation. No visible Japanese Canadian community, loss of culture and identity. Wanted, model citizen. All Japanese Canadians are law-abiding. This past year, I did a major work, which shows where I am now. It's called Mixed Blessings. My children and my grandchildren are the best of me. They are also the end of my Japanese heritage, both genetically and culturally. They do not look like me in appearance, and therefore mark the end of my Japanese line, Mixed Blessings. But I celebrate the fact that they are a new kind of people, children of the world. My grandchildren carry the DNA of ancestors from far corners of the world: Japanese, English, Irish, French, Scottish, Dutch, German, Jamaican, Egyptian, African, Polish. Perhaps when the whole world is filled with children of the world, it will truly be a world of mixed blessings. My latest project is a collaboration with Jeff Chiba Stearns, an animation artist and filmmaker. We created it for our mixed-race children. The graphic novel that we worked on together is called On Being Yukiko. In the novel, On Being Yukiko, and my picture bride story, which was separate and is now part of this joint effort. The story is the main vehicle for Japanese Canadian grandmother to tell her mixed race granddaughter her family story of internment and forced relocation by the government of Canada. Jeff has created an incredible animation. Papa means half Japanese, which explores the issues of identity for young people. While the particular story is about the Japanese Canadian experience, it can be a springboard for the stories of all cultures coming to Canada. It is relevant not only for mixed-race Japanese Canadians, but for mixed-race people of all cultures. It makes mixed-race people know that they are not alone. Because mixed-race people are the fastest-growing demographic in North America, this book could have a huge reach. I think that this book could have a great impact in education because it teaches inclusive values and anti-racist education at so many levels. I'm just going to show you a few pages from the book. Jeff will be talking about two of his award-winning films in week 9 of the Daima. So, thank you very much. Thanks for tuning in.
Well, thank you, Lillian. That was wonderful. First off, to everybody out there, sorry if you notice we are running late, but I do have some questions I want to ask Lillian, and if anybody out there has any questions, we will. I won't say we'll go to help answer all of them, but we'll definitely try to extend as much as we can. So when you, because a lot of your work, it's not only centers on the Japanese Canadian incarceration experience, but also is deeply personal about your the questions you had with your identity as a Canadian, almost seemingly to be versus you being Japanese. And that later on in life that you finally were able to find a way to bring these together. Was there any point in time in your life where all of a sudden that started becoming clear to you that you are both, that you're equally both in many ways?
Well, as I said, it's in the last 20 years of my life, that I really started to accept myself as Japanese Canadian and to deal with my identity issues of not speaking about who I am and not identifying myself as who I am.
So was it a gradual thing, or was there like something that happened that all of a sudden it became more clear to you?
It was after my, I asked my mom to write her story, and that was the first time that I really realized, exactly how horrible the whole situation was. And it just got me thinking. And of course, for 30 years in teaching, I had been working with marginalized children to bring out their stories. But the terrible thing, I think, in hindsight, is that I never told them my story. And it took me a long time to just work up enough courage to do it. And the exhibition at the Cultural Center was the first one. And then the next was a mainstream gallery, which was even more frightening because it was on Remembrance Day and veterans were having a display upstairs.
Mm. Wow.
So yes, it's over the years, but then I wanted to present it in different ways to approach, to get different audiences. And that's why we, ended up with the graphic novel, because I think that children would be able to relate to that. And so it's been gradual, but now I've come to, accept myself for who I am. But I still feel uncomfortable because I can't speak the language, even though I understand quite a bit. And, Japanese, people wouldn't really understand how I could understand what's being said, and I can't communicate back.
Wow. How about your mom? Did she have any of these, like an identity issue, especially because, it's,
She didn't.
she didn't?
My mom was a really exceptional person. I mean, she was so lovely that everybody loved her, especially kids of any kind used to come just to talk to her. So she really didn't. She knew who she was, and she even went
to Japan with her sister. They visited in 1995.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that she met, cousins and so forth, that she'd never known about. So, but she could speak Japanese fluently.
Okay.
So it was not difficult for her to fit in.
Okay. Wow. So, you consider yourself to be a social activist because one of the big things you try to do is educate people about the Canadian or Canada's history, I guess, and this part of it that, like in America, the incarceration was hidden; people didn't know about it. And all the years of you exhibiting your work, was there a venue or a show or a presentation you did that stood out as maybe more successful in communicating to people the injustice that was perpetrated upon the Japanese Canadians?
Well, I mean, in the introduction, you mentioned the Royal Ontario Museum. And I think that one was the turning point for reaching many more people, rather than small gatherings, because over a 6-month period, thousands of people came.
Wow.
And the gallery that it's shown in is the Gallery of Canadian History, so that school children, like busloads, came to see that. And the ROM is one of the largest museums in North America, and it's the most visited museum in Canada. And in a way, it's sort of ironic, that it took a mainstream gallery institution, of that caliber to make our story known. Because even now, there are people who never knew that this had happened, because I think for a long time, Canadians seem to be, they really didn't think that anything bad happened here. And the remarkable thing about that show is that the Japanese Canadian community demanded that they add a Japanese Canadian curator, and they ended up inviting two, Bryce Kambara and Dr. Catherine Yamashita, to join the two ROM curators. And they had also never included authentic voices before this exhibition, and so that it was really sort of patronizing to take somebody's story and present it not as the people wanted. And they really did have a problem with cultural appropriation in their Out of Africa exhibit a few years ago. So this was a huge step for the ROM, and in view of what's happening today, it was really probably the first, the first exhibition of that caliber that included the people, the people that they were presenting. So, but it was unorthodox. It was deliberately embedded in the Sigmund Samuel Gallery of Canada, along with the British and French colonial displays, rather than as a standalone exhibition. And there were, there were people, who protested that. They felt it should be by itself, but they didn't realize, that it did make a statement that the Japanese Canadian story is an important part of the history of Canada. And it made us feel as if we finally belong as citizens again. And my mom would have been really proud, because my portrait of her became the signature image, for the exhibition.
Yeah, I noticed that when I actually read the article, and I remember seeing, after actually getting a hold of you and saying, "Oh, that was the piece that I saw on the article." So yeah, congratulations on that. That's special.
Actually, there are a whole lot of articles that were produced by mainstream media, and all of it was really positive. Like, we didn't even have a single word of protest or denial. It was really very well accepted.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we got a question here. Oh boy. I don't know if I can pronounce this here. Hang on a second. But anyhow, let's see.
Risha?
Risha.
Yeah.
So as an artist, writer, and storyteller, how does the process of storytelling through art come together for you? From narrative, from emotion, what is your artistic process? Sounds like Risha's an artist herself.
It did start with that one painting. That
Uh-huh.
was, before my mother, told the story. But my mother's story is really the catalyst, because the more I read it, the more I realized, that people needed to know what had happened. And I think, when you tell a story, through your own personal experience, they can't take that away from you.
Mhm.
And they can't say you're making it up. So I think that telling the truth is the most important thing. And it is emotional because it's not something that you like doing, revisiting, the horror of the past. But, I want to make, my art meaningful in the best way possible in the few remaining years that I have. So, yeah, it comes from emotion. It comes from my mother's story. It, and I think, that I would really, really like to get that graphic novel into schools, field tested in schools, because it could be a springboard for anti-racist education, because teachers would have a hard time getting into it. But that way they can look at at a story that isn't their own, and kids can understand what happened, because it's happened to many kids, and from different cultures, from around the world.
Okay. Wow. Um, so one reason I mentioned that I wanted a Canadian artist to come in and be part of Tadaima was because as Americans, we know, or I shouldn't say we know, because it's been tough sometimes getting the information out, but we've we understand, and we're learning more and more about the Japanese American incarceration, and so we understand, when it occurred. We understand who got affected by it. But you guys aren't that far from us yet. The Canadian incarceration is really unknown. I mean, we don't know much about it. I was surprised when when I was researching uh, your experiences. I was amazed on how obviously there were a lot of commonality things, but how different certain things were. I mean, first off, it lasted ours ended, after the war. Yours went to 1949.
Yeah.
So do you know why it went those extra years? And do you know why it went those extra years?
Well,
What was the
because
reason for it?
there are politicians, from BC really wanted to make sure we never ever went back. So this is why, Japanese Canadians got nothing back. They didn't get their houses or their belongings. They did promise, to store the belongings, until after the war, but people just took the stuff. I mean, they really just literally stole it. And then, what do you go back to if you have no place to live, and you don't want to go back to a place, where you're not wanted.
Mhm. So they're trying to have you almost like have ownership of that new place, and that would become home. Was that the idea?
But then my father realized, that he could not. They couldn't. The two of them had to work 10 acres,
Hmm.
and there's no way, that you could keep doing that forever.
Hmm.
Really, really, really very hard work. Like my mother almost died. She got nephritis, and she was in the hospital for 40 days. So my baby sister, my dad put her, with this elderly couple, and he carried me on his back and did the whole 20 acres by himself. So you can't keep doing this. And as well as, I was only a year old then.
Hmm.
So, you know, it was really too tough. And he made the decision after they allowed us to travel in Canada to go to Ontario, because his best friend went a few months before. But it
Hmm.
took them 10 years to save up enough money for the train fare, because the two of them only earned $900 a year between the two of them.
So when they left, they like in America, the government basically bought them a ticket to where in America they want to go. Canadian government didn't do that.
Oh no, that's why it took them that long to get
Mm.
just the train fare for the four of us.
Oh.
No, they didn't pay for anything, And even in, the people who went to the internment camps in the middle of the mountains, they had to pay for their own internment, as well as, whoever was able to, they had to build their own houses.
Yeah, I was reading about that. The government confiscated their houses and fishing boats and cars, and then sold them to pay for that.
Them into the Pacific exhibition grounds in the animal barns for about 4 months. While because they didn't know what to do with them.
Wow.
And it was only women and children that went there, and the men had to work really hard, on those road gangs, like creating roads. But so the only choice, like they had two choices. It was either go to the internment camp and separate the family, or as my grandmother, she chose to go to Alberta, even though the life was terrible, because she wanted the family to stay together.
Wow.
So yeah, it was really hard. And then of course coming to Ontario, I had to start all over again. But luckily there was a dry cleaning business, begun by a Japanese man, and he had 32 stores. So he hired anybody, any Japanese Canadian who came to Ontario. So both my parents started working there, and
that's good.
Yeah, we lived in 2 rooms behind one of the stores that she worked in.
Oh, okay. It was actually it was the store's place, so basically they paid for them to be there.
A 2-room apartment behind.
Yeah. Okay.
And we were there until I was in, we came when I was in grade 2, and we stayed there till I was in grade 10.
Wow.
And then they decided to create a subway station there, so everybody had to leave, and that's when my parents bought a variety store, and so moving again.
Wow. Well, we are way over, so I'm afraid we have to probably call it a night. But I just want to thank you, partly for just the education that I received from you, partly from just meeting you. You a wonderful person, and for your sharing of your art.
Well, thank you.
Really appreciate it.
And Royce as well for putting all of this together. It's really wonderful, and I'm really grateful to you for this experience to talk to Americans about what happened to us. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. So next week I have for artist is Christine Aono, and the one interesting thing about doing the art, and this is nothing against any of the other artists that are going to be on Tadaima, but Christine was the first artist I thought of when I was tasked to find the artists. And the reason why I'll explain to you next week in my introduction. So until next week,